I was recently speaking with a procurement manager for a major defense contractor, someone used to dealing with billion-dollar budgets and cutting-edge aerospace tech. He looked exhausted. He told me about a high-level briefing he attended where they were mapping out the production of a new radar system, the kind of hardware that defines modern air superiority. The room was filled with engineers and analysts discussing sophisticated chip architectures and proprietary software. But then the presentation just stopped. The issue wasn't a software bug or a design flaw. It was a few kilograms of gray metallic powder called antimony. He described the feeling in the room as a sort of technological vertigo. It was as if they were master chefs standing in a world-class kitchen, surrounded by the finest stoves and knives, only to realize someone had locked the cabinet where the salt is kept. Without those few kilos of boring minerals, the billion-dollar project was essentially a pile of scrap metal. He said for the first time in his career, he wasn't looking at spreadsheets of profit margins. He was looking at photos of shipping crates and court documents. On December 18, that locked cabinet became official. China didn't just tweak a few trade rules. They tightened a noose. They confirmed a rigorous new licensing system for rare earths, gallium, and germanium, the lifeblood of the semiconductor industry. But what really chilled the room was the news of the prison sentences. People were actually being sent to jail for trying to sneak these materials out of the country. It marks a dramatic shift in the tech war. For years, the narrative has been about the West restricting China's access to the brains, the high-end chips and AI software. But now, China is retaliating by cutting off the flesh and bone, the raw materials that make those brains possible. It's a classic asymmetric strike, using a monopoly on the dirt in the ground to paralyze the most sophisticated labs in the world. As we watch the global supply chain begin to buckle, the question is no longer who has the best code, but who is willing to play the resource card until the other side starves.
That story, that image of the locked salt cabinet, it perfectly captures the dilemma, doesn't it?
It really does.
We're so focused on the shiny objects, the advanced chips, the stealth fighters, the AI algorithms.
The end product.
The end product. And we've completely, utterly ignored the foundational stuff, the boring, low-volume materials that everything, and I mean everything, runs on. What you're describing is the weaponization of the supply chain itself.
Okay, so let's really unpack this, because that anecdote, that feeling of technological vertigo over a few kilos of antimony, it just flips the whole script. So our mission today for this deep dive is to figure out how this incredible level of leverage was actually built. We need to explore the decades-long foundation of China's dominance in these materials.
Yeah, the structural advantage.
Yeah, the structural advantage. Then we need to get into the immediate shock of these new, very precise controls on gallium and germanium. And finally, we have to look ahead, forecast the real-world impact this is having on global industries, especially defense and green energy, because this isn't theoretical anymore. The disruption is already happening.
And that's the point. It's not a bump in the road.
No. This is about one nation having the power to control the very tempo of global technological progress.
That word you just used, tempo, that's absolutely key here. This isn't about market fluctuations. It's not about, commodity prices going up and down. This is a deliberately deployed strategic tool, a non-kinetic deterrent, really. It's a model of structural suppression that's designed to slow down or maybe even halt the innovation schedules of entire nations.
All right, so let's start with that immediate pressure point. The weaponization of these two specific elements, gallium and germanium, and how this fits into China's, their evolving strategy of resource control.
It's fascinating when you look at how their approach has evolved over time. Back in 2011, they briefly halted rare earth exports to Japan.
Right, over a territorial dispute. I remember that.
Exactly. But that was, it was a policy bludgeon. It was blunt. It caused chaos, but they pulled it back pretty quickly. And it probably cost them a lot of goodwill. So
they learned from that experience. They've moved from the bludgeon to something much more like a scalpel. A precision tool.
A precision tool, that's a perfect way to put it. That initial sort of threat has now evolved into this comprehensive legal and regulatory framework. It was all formalized in their 2020 export control law.
And that law is the key piece of the puzzle here.
It is. It gave Beijing the legal authority it needed to control the export of dual-use items, materials with both commercial and military applications, with incredible efficiency. And critically, it included a provision that was, frankly, unprecedented. It claimed extraterritorial jurisdiction.
Okay, that phrase, extraterritorial jurisdiction, it sounds.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds terrifying for a global company. But is it really enforceable in say, a court in Europe or the US? Or is it more of a political tool?
Well, it's both, really. Enforcing it in a Western court would be, let's say, legally complex, but its real power comes from the fact that it puts foreign companies in an impossible position.
A catch-22.
Completely. Either you comply with Beijing's export rules, or you risk facing legal trouble inside China, which could wreck your supply chains, affect your employees there, or, and this is the biggest threat, you just lose access to the material altogether. It basically set the stage for these very targeted controls we're seeing now.
And the targets they chose are so strategic. Gallium, germanium, and antimony. I mean, the numbers are just staggering. China has a near total monopoly on primary gallium production. We're talking, what, 98% of the world's supply?
A startling 98%. And then you have significant control over germanium, around 68%, and nearly half of all antimony production at 48%.
That 98% figure for gallium, that's the one that just stops you in your tracks.
It's acute leverage, especially because the global demand for refined gallium is actually quite small. It's less than 700 metric tons a year.
So because the market is so small, even a tiny restriction has a huge impact.
A massive impact. It creates huge price volatility and immediate shortages. When you have a near total monopoly on a small but critical market, even a small targeted control becomes a major global crisis.
Let's walk through the timeline here, because the way they escalated these controls shows just how calculated this was. It wasn't an instant ban.
No, not at all. It was very deliberate.
It started sort of cautiously in July 2023. They announced these initial licensing requirements for gallium and germanium exports. And at the time, everyone saw it as a tit-for-tat response to the U.S. chip restrictions.
That was the warning shot, we can do this too message. But the really decisive move, the real escalation, came much later.
Right. In December of 2024, after the U.S. expanded its own chip controls, China's Ministry of Commerce issued an update that was, for all intents and purposes, a functional embargo.
A functional embargo on exports of gallium, germanium, antimony, and also super hard materials, specifically to the United States.
And this is where that extraterritorial jurisdiction you mentioned really came into play, right?
It became very real very fast. The ruling explicitly asserted that long-arm jurisdiction, declaring that any organization anywhere in the world would be held responsible if they acted as a middleman.
So they were trying to cut off workarounds before they could even be established.
Exactly. It formally outlawed re-export or transshipment through third countries. They saw the inevitable response would be these indirect trade routes, and they moved to shut them down preemptively.
But then, less than a month later, they made another move, one that was much quieter, but maybe even more damaging. January 2nd, 2025. They expanded the restrictions to the extraction technology itself. Why is targeting the know-how, the technology, potentially a bigger deal than just restricting the material?
This is the really nuanced part of the strategy, the part that guarantees their dominance for the long term. See, gallium isn't mined directly. It's a byproduct of processing aluminum from bauxite ore.
Yeah.
And to get that gallium out cheaply and efficiently, you need incredibly sophisticated chemical separation techniques. The best method, the leading edge one, is called the ion exchange resin method.
So by restricting the export of the technology for that method,
they ensure that even if other countries want to start extracting their own gallium, they can't do it cost effectively. They're stuck with older, more expensive, less efficient methods.
So China controls the refined product, and now they also control the recipe for making a competing product at an affordable price.
Precisely. And we've seen data that shows just how big a barrier this is. There's a key Chinese chemical company, Sunresin, that produces up to 90% of the special chelating resin you need for this process globally.
90%.
So if China stops exporting that resin technology, building a cost-competitive recovery line anywhere else in the world becomes, incredibly difficult. It's a technology lock-in.
And then they backed all of this up with legal muscle. In May 2025, there was this coordinated crackdown involving the Ministry of Commerce and the Ministry of State Security to stop smuggling.
Right, which brings us back to enforcement. The 12-year prison sentence they gave to a strategic mineral smuggler, a man named Wang, shows just how seriously Beijing is taking this. It's a signal.
It transforms these materials from just, commodities into strategic national assets.
It absolutely does. I was reading the details on that case. This man, Wang, he'd been operating in the shadows for years, moving tons of antimony and gallium across borders in mislabeled crates. For him, they were just high-value rocks,
A way to make a quick buck.
Exactly. But when that judge handed down a 12-year sentence, it sent a shockwave. The severity just signaled that the era where China's upstream treasures could be treated like common gravel was definitively over. The legal hammer reinforces the policy.
So despite some initial optimism from executives who said, we've got diversified supply lines, the market data told a very different story very quickly. What was the immediate fallout?
The most direct quantifiable impact was the price split, a decoupling, really. Since the controls began in summer 2023, the price of gallium outside of China, which is tracked on the Rotterdam Exchange, has just completely disconnected from the domestic Chinese price.
We saw that by early 2024, the external price was already nearly double the price inside China.
And that gap just exploded after the December 2024 embargo declaration. By May 2025, the Rotterdam price for gallium hit $687 per kilogram. That's a 150% increase from before the controls started.
A massive price shock.
It confirms how effective their actions are. And what's really telling is that while this was happening, domestic gallium prices inside China were actually falling.
Because of oversupply from their own industries.
Right, from their solar industry. The fact that they aren't exporting this excess supply, even with that massive international price premium, shows you this is not a supply issue. It's a deliberate policy choice.
And you can see the real-world pain this is causing for allied nations. Firms in Japan and South Korea.
They've been reporting months-long waits for licenses or just getting outright denials for critical materials. One Japanese electronics executive was even quoted saying, "The rules were basically a declaration of economic war against the rest of the world. The supply chain is actively being throttled."
So why gallium? Of all the materials, why target this relatively small market? We said it's a byproduct of aluminum processing, which seems key to understanding how they got this control.
Gallium is the perfect strategic choke point. Over the last couple of decades, China's state-owned companies like Chelco came to dominate global aluminum production.
Right.
As a side effect of that massive scale, they perfected the processes to recover and refine gallium from the waste tailings. This created huge overcapacity, which allowed them to flood the low-purity gallium market around 2010.
And that drove out all the international competitors.
Exactly. They just couldn't compete on price. So you had this massive investment in a standard industry, aluminum, that unintentionally created a global monopoly in a high-tech byproduct, gallium.
A monopoly that was then, as we're seeing, intentionally weaponized. And its importance for high-end defense systems.
Yeah.
It's all about gallium nitride, or gallium.
Yes, gallium.
We hear that term, GaN, all the time in defense circles. For you listening, what does GaN actually do that a normal silicon chip can't?
So think about a regular computer chip. It gets hot, it loses energy through inefficiency, especially when you push a lot of power through it. GaN is what we call a wide bandgap semiconductor.
Okay.
That means its transistors can operate at much higher voltages and temperatures with way less energy loss. This efficiency makes them absolutely essential for power conversion, for electronic warfare, and most critically, for advanced radar systems.
So they're foundational to modern air and missile defense.
Absolutely foundational. You look at the most sensitive U.S. defense platforms, the F-35's advanced ASA radar system, the Navy's giant ANIS PY-6 radar, which is the backbone of their fleet's air defense.
The Marine Corps Gator radar, too.
All of them. They all rely on GaN-backed modules for their power and their clarity. So if the supply of gallium feedstock gets squeezed,
then the production, the maintenance, and even future upgrades for those critical systems are immediately vulnerable.
Critically vulnerable. And the dependency is terrifyingly deep. Open source assessments show that over 11,000 individual parts used across the U.S. Department of Defense need gallium. And here's the kicker. 85% of those supply chains have at least one Chinese supplier in them, even if it's 5 or 6 steps removed. This dependence is structural. It's not superficial.
Okay, so this gallium and germanium crisis is the immediate squeeze. But that's a card they can only play because, as you said, they spent 40 years building this incredible foundation of control over the entire rare earth value chain. This wasn't just an accident of geology, was it?
Not at all. It was a deliberate, sustained national strategy, and that's the key distinction. We have to look past the image of, miners digging dirt out of the ground and see the sustained high-level investment in science and technology that started way back in the 1980s.
Let's pinpoint that moment. In 1985, China established its first national rare earth laboratory. What was the scale of that initial commitment? It must have been huge.
It was immense, and it signaled this was a national priority. That first effort was backed by a cohort of over 3,000 scientists and engineers. I mean, just stop and think about that for a second.
3,000 dedicated experts.
3,000 experts assigned to a relatively niche field 4 decades ago, before the tech revolution really even took off.
That is just remarkable foresight. At that same time, most Western countries saw rare earths as, a messy, environmentally damaging business they were happy to offshore?
Exactly. China saw it as a future strategic necessity. And they backed that vision with real institutional support. The whole infrastructure involved collaboration across over 300 research institutes and 40 universities, all dedicated to rare earth programs.
So while the West was reacting to market cycles, China was proactively building this pipeline of specialized human capital.
Yes. And how does that look today? Well, it's only deepened. Today, China operates 4 national labs that are exclusively focused on rare earths. They have at least 39 universities with dedicated RE programs. They're churning out thousands of graduates every year with this highly specific, nuanced knowledge that you need for every single part of the process.
From chemical separation to metallic conversion.
Every single step. So we're talking about creating human capital that can manage the entire value chain, top to bottom. It's expertise that's almost impossible to quickly import or replicate somewhere else.
The human capital investment itself is the competitive moat.
It's the single greatest moat they have. It's about a decades-long, specialized, integrated workforce. You know, if you estimate the number of professional scientists and government-funded researchers working just on rare earths, that number could easily be over 12,000 people.
Which leads to that incredible statistic, the 120-to-1 researcher ratio.
Right. For every one full-time government-funded researcher working on this in the United States, China has roughly 120. That ratio, it's not just a funding difference. It represents a fundamental, prioritized national strategic depth. It guarantees they stay ahead.
And that massive R&D investment translated directly into industrial dominance. But you're saying the real power isn't in the mining, it's in the middle. The midstream processing.
Yes, exactly. That's the real choke point.
So for you listening, let's define that choke point. Why is the separation process so much harder than just digging the ore out of the ground?
Well, rare earth elements, all 15 of them, are chemically very, very similar, and they're often bonded together in the ore. So separating them into high-purity oxides, like, say, isolating neodymium from praseodymium, is this tedious, energy-intensive, and historically very polluting process. It requires complex chemical solvent extraction.
And China controls, 87% of the global capacity for that crucial step?
87%. It's overwhelming. And they maintain that dominance with strategically massive overcapacity.
Right.
You can look at data from the GU region back in 2013. Their heavy rare earth separation capacity was 4 times the entire world's output for that year. That scale does 2 things. It ensures a stable global supply, which is good for consumers, but it also creates an impassable cost hurdle for any potential competitor.
So let's talk about that cost hurdle. How does their efficiency become a competitive moat that just keeps newcomers out of the market?
It's because their process is so efficient, honed over decades of optimization, that their profit margin from the separated elements to the final metallics is razor thin. We're talking maybe 5%. So any new Western startup trying to build a new environmentally compliant plant from scratch would be facing higher costs, lower scale, and 0 guaranteed market share. They simply cannot compete on price against a 5% margin without huge, sustained government subsidies. The efficiency itself locks up the global midstream process.
And this control over processing leads us directly to the core component of so much modern technology, high-performance magnets. The kind that make everything from EVs to missile guidance systems work.
If you look at modern tech, the limiting factor is so often heat. A standard magnet starts to demagnetize above 65 degrees Celsius. But for an EV motor or a massive wind turbine or a defense system, you need magnets that stay stable up to 180, maybe even 220 degrees Celsius.
And that stability, that's achieved by adding or doping the magnets with heavy rare earth elements, or HREs.
Correct. The key ones are terbium, TB, and dysprosium dye. They stabilize the crystal structure and stop that thermal breakdown. They are absolutely indispensable for the high-temperature grades, the SH and EH grades of neodymium iron-boron magnets.
And this brings us to what might be the clearest technological choke point of all. China maintains 100% control over the separated terbium and dysprosium needed for these critical magnets. 100%.
100%. So without that separated HRE supply, higher-end applications are just. They're technologically capped. The performance ceiling of your final product is limited by the availability of materials controlled entirely by a single supply chain.
And it was that guaranteed supply, plus the fact that China could make the specialized magnet production equipment for a fraction of the cost.
Sometimes a third of the cost of Western equipment, yeah. That created what the industry called an irresistible economic proposition. It basically forced the major global magnet producers to move their production inside China.
It's a completely vertically integrated system designed to attract and then lock in global manufacturing. And behind all this data, there's a human story. We heard this fascinating perspective from a scientist, Dr. Li in Ganzhou.
Yes. Her perspective is so important for understanding the mindset behind this. For her predecessors, success was measured in how many tons of cheap ore they could ship out.
Right.
For Dr. Li, success is measured in 99.99999% purity of the elements she refines with their proprietary technology. She remembers when her mentors were treated like, quarry workers for the global tech industry.
And now she sees international firms scrambling to match what her team can do.
Exactly. And for her, it's a source of profound intellectual pride. This isn't just trade policy. It's about resource sovereignty, the right of a nation to be valued for its brain power and refined innovation, not just the dirt under its feet. It's the heart of that whole shift from being the world's mine to being the world's refinery.
That level of control, it doesn't just stop with magnets or defense. It extends to the entire global push for the green energy transition. I mean, if we're going to electrify transportation and stabilize the grid, this structural dominance is absolutely critical.
Exactly. The magnet dominance is just one piece of this puzzle. The true depth becomes visible when you map out the entire EV battery supply chain. It's foundational to the future of cars, of grid storage, everything.
Okay, let's look at the chemical building blocks for a lithium-ion battery.
China has systematically used its scale to dominate the processing of almost every single key chemical input. On the cathode side of the battery, we're talking 55% of global lithium processing, 65% of cobalt, and 35% of nickel processing.
So they control the refinement that turns raw ore into battery-ready powder.
Comprehensive control. But those numbers, as big as they are nothing compared to their control over the anode material, specifically graphite.
This number is just astonishing.
It is the ultimate bottleneck. Graphite is the foundation for the anode, the negative end of the battery. And the key figure here is 99% of global spherical graphite processing capacity.
99%. And we should be clear, spherical graphite isn't just raw rock you dig up. It's highly purified, highly engineered material.
Yes, it has to be shaped to make the anode work efficiently and safely. So while you might mine the raw graphite in Africa or Brazil, that crucial purification and shaping step is almost entirely consolidated in China.
And that process is incredibly capital and energy intensive.
Which creates a profound, almost impossible competitive moat for anyone else to overcome quickly. If you control 99% of a crucial refining step for the anode, you fundamentally dictate the cost and the production tempo of every single EV battery sold on the planet.
And this dominance at the input stage just flows seamlessly downstream into manufacturing the components themselves.
The processing dominance gives way to total manufacturing control. China controls 92% of global cathode capacity, 91% of anode capacity, and over 79% of the finished battery cell manufacturing capacity.
They built the engine, they control the fuel, and they control the output.
And this is only going to deepen. Projections show that by 2029, China is on track to host 88 of the 115 planned lithium-ion battery megafactories in the world. This isn't just current leadership, it's planned future industrial consolidation.
And we see this exact same pattern replicated in the solar panel sector, right? It confirms this is an integrated strategy across the entire renewable energy complex.
It is. The global ambition for decarbonization is right now entirely reliant on China's solar PV capacity.
Let's run through those figures, starting with polysilicon.
China controls nearly 80% of polysilicon production. That's the foundational raw material. But the concentration just gets more extreme at the next step, which is more complex. They have a near total monopoly on wafers, the thin slices cut from the polysilicon, at 96.8%.
Wow.
Then it's 85.7% of the conversion into solar cells and about 75% of the finished modules you see on roofs around the world.
So if you want solar power anywhere on Earth, the chances are extraordinarily high that the foundational slices of silicon came from a single industrial system.
And this scale isn't just happening randomly. It's governed by their high-quality development strategy. This policy actively restricts high-energy, low-value industries like crude steel or crude aluminum, and it funnels those resources toward higher-value, more efficient processes like high-purity polysilicon and battery components.
It's a systemic push toward greater technological sophistication.
It is, and it reinforces that idea of resource sovereignty we talked about. They're coupling their resource inheritance with technological mastery, prioritizing innovation and breakthroughs that translate directly into industrial and economic advantages.
Okay, so we've laid out the foundation of control. Now we have to turn to the strategic consequences. You describe this supply cutoff as a form of non-kinetic deterrence. Is this just economic warfare, or is it something structurally worse?
I'd say it's structurally worse because it targets tempo.
Yeah.
Economic warfare usually tries to inflict immediate financial pain, right? Cripple an economy broadly. This resource suppression model is different. It's designed to disrupt the industrial tempo of an adversary's defense systems.
So you can think of it as a chain reaction.
It is a chain. It goes export policy to the resource layer, your magnets, your gallium, to the equipment node layer, the F-35, the submarine, and finally to the battlefield capability layer, which is systemic degradation.
So the disruption doesn't look like a stock market crash. It looks like a production line stalling or a maintenance queue for critical systems getting longer and longer.
Exactly. It's a non-linear chain of decay. The key effect is the asymmetric system degradation. You just stop being able to build or service your most critical, sophisticated components, which leads to this gradual but irreversible decline in your actual warfighting capability over time.
Let's try to quantify that reliance. Public data suggests more than 95% of key U.S. military equipment has a dependency on China's supply system for these critical materials. That's a profound vulnerability.
It is. And we can look at specific, incredibly high-value platforms. Take the Virginia-class nuclear submarine. It represents the single largest point of material dependency in the entire defense system.
How much rare earth material are we talking about for just one of those subs?
It's about 4,173 kilograms per ship. That is 10 times the amount in an F-35 fighter jet.
Wow. And what is it used for?
It's essential for the propulsion motors, for the quieting technology that makes them so stealthy, and for critical control systems. Models suggest that if the supply were cut off, the annual loss from construction delays in just this one program could be somewhere between $30 and $40 billion.
For one program. Tens of billions in losses annually because of a lack of refined dirt. What about the F-35?
The F-35, the symbol of modern air power, needs about 418 kilograms of rare earths for its radar, its electronic warfare systems, its engines. If production and maintenance get halted, the estimated annual loss is still substantial, around $20 to $25 billion. These are costs that are almost impossible to just absorb.
And then there's a new generation of technology that depends on gallium and germanium chips, AI platforms, precision-guided missiles.
Yeah, AI systems are heavily dependent on these high-efficiency JAWMAN and germanium chips. Simulations show that those platforms would start seeing performance degradation really quickly, within maybe 2 to 4 months if you couldn't get replacement parts. And crucially, precision-guided missiles rely on those high-performance magnets made with terbium and samarium. Once your war stocks are depleted, your inability to mass produce more just fundamentally reduces your tactical power.
So the vulnerability hits both the legacy systems and the next generation ones.
It's comprehensive.
You mentioned that the impact is a time-based decay, not an instant collapse. So what is the strategic window this suppression model creates?
The simulation models show this asymmetric fault-based decay. The U.S. military's capability index starts a significant decline in year 2, and that's what creates the strategic window for a competitor.
Okay, so let's break down that projected timeline so you, the listener, can really understand the urgency here.
Right. So, years 1 to 3 are what we'd call the initial depletion phase. Your existing stockpiles get consumed. You might maintain full capability in year 1, but you rapidly enter a decline zone in year 2 as resources break. You start seeing the first tactical weakenings, delays, and upgrades.
Then we get to years 4 to 6. This is the technology gap emergence phase.
This is where the strategy really starts to pay off for the one imposing the controls. The modeling suggests U.S. military power could slip to less than 60% of its original capacity here. Core programs like the F-35 Block 4 upgrade or new AI projects just stagnate. They face huge delays.
And while one side is stalling, the other is accelerating.
That's the structural difference. While the U.S. is struggling to rebuild supply chains, the competitor can start deploying their next-generation capabilities, hypersonic systems, 6th-gen fighters, and actually reverse the technological gap. the tempo advantage is flipped.
Which brings us to year 7 to 10, the systemic lag solidification period.
At this point, the capability curve is in a range that's very difficult to recover from. The gap becomes structural, irreversible in the short term. You could be looking at a 5+ year lag in your theater, sensing, and response chains. The key finding is that this whole model is designed to maximize that strategic window between years 4 and 8. It makes it functionally impossible to catch up with a quick fix.
And the reason it's so powerful is that the defense against it, rebuilding your own processing capacity, is just profoundly difficult.
The costs and the timeframes are generational. They're not just items in a budget.
So let's look at those numbers. What are we talking about financially and in terms of time to rebuild this midstream processing chain?
To fully reconstruct the rare earth refining capacity outside of China, the estimated investment is somewhere around $60 billion. And that would require a lead time of 5 to 7 years just to get it operational and efficient.
And for the lithium battery industry.
Even more daunting. You're looking at over $100 billion and an 8 to 10-year commitment.
Which just reinforces the point that the issue is the technological capability, not just the raw dirt in the ground.
Exactly. That $60 to $100 billion. It's not just capital for buildings. It's a generational investment in specialized scientists in chemical engineering, environmental compliance. That staggering cost and that multi-year time lag, that is the single greatest point of leverage. It solidifies the advantage.
Okay, so given the severity of these controls, especially the embargo targeting the U.S. market, the global supply chain is obviously scrambling for workarounds. Re-exporting through third countries seems like the most obvious one.
And that loophole has been the immediate focus. The data is pretty clear. Chinese customs reported 0 gallium and germanium exports going directly to the U.S. in 2024. But U.S. trade data tells a different story. It confirms imports still arrived, which implies they came through third countries.
The data points pretty strongly to one conduit in particular, Belgium.
Yes. China's germanium exports to Belgium jumped by a massive 224% in 2024. And that increase almost perfectly matched the decrease in their direct exports to the U.S. It strongly suggests Belgium was acting as a re-exportation hub.
And this is precisely what Beijing's new extraterritorial controls, the ones from December 2024, are designed to shut down.
Exactly. The pressure is now squarely on those foreign firms. A company in Belgium supplying a U.S. defense contractor now risks losing access to its only viable source of raw material if it's caught circumventing the ban.
So it creates this powerful financial incentive for them to just stop serving U.S. customers rather than risk angering Beijing.
Right. So what are the countermeasures? Well, one obvious gap is stockpiling. The U.S. has a national defense stockpile for germanium, but critically, it doesn't have one for gallium.
That gallium gap is a major vulnerability to a sudden shock.
It is. And beyond just stockpiling, you need new initiatives to support domestic recovery. For example, supporting scrap recovery efforts. There is a company in Texas, MTM Critical Metals, that's trying to extract gallium from industrial scrap.
And the key to making a project like that viable is protecting it from market manipulation, right?
Absolutely. The moment a new competitor pops up, the dominant producer can just flood the market, crash the price, and kill the competitor before they even reach scale.
So how do you protect against that?
MTM is reportedly negotiating what are called price floor contracts. These are designed to shield them from a sudden Chinese price dump. A government-backed contract would guarantee a minimum price, ensuring the domestic production can survive even if China tries to weaponize prices against it.
So this geopolitical pressure has created a really interesting dynamic in Southeast Asia. It's positioning countries there as this critical nexus, a kind of technological DMZ between the two giants.
It is. We're seeing this shift towards synergy rather than a forced complete decoupling. I was reading this fascinating interview with a logistics manager, Siti, who works in Penang, Malaysia, what they call Silicon Island. And she described her daily work as a diplomatic mission inside a warehouse. On one dock, she's handling advanced processing equipment coming in from Chinese partners who are now sharing their refining techniques. And on the other dock, she's coordinating with Western firms who are desperate for the stable supply that this new Malaysia-China synergy can provide.
So she sees herself at the center of this new technological DMZ, building a buffer.
A buffer that keeps the whole global supply chain from snapping. It's a perfect illustration of how Southeast Asia is leveraging its experienced workforce and its geography to be an industrial bridge. Countries like Malaysia, which is a big semiconductor packaging hub, and Singapore, an R&D anchor, are actively seeking complementarity.
So Chinese chip firms are using Malaysian packaging houses to assemble high-end chips.
Exactly. They're hedging against U.S. sanctions by diversifying their assembly outside the mainland while also capitalizing on Malaysia's experienced, affordable workforce. It gives China sanctions relief, and it gives the global supply chain some much-needed diversification.
So you end up with this regional model of interdependence that kind of stabilizes things.
It does. The ASEAN model is moving towards this complementary system. You have Vietnam for cost-efficient assembly, Malaysia for packaging and automation, and Singapore for the upstream design and R&D. It creates this robust regional hub that strengthens resilience for everyone, proving that, for now, synergy is really the only way to maintain a high-tech global lifestyle without a complete structural collapse.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We're looking at a masterclass in strategic resource control, executed over 4 decades. Before we wrap up, let's just distill the core insights for you.
First, and I think this is the most important point, China's material dominance is not an accident. It's a result of a successful long-term national strategy. It's built on unmatched R&D investment. That 120-to-1 researcher ratio is key vertical integration with 87% of separation capacity and just relentless industrial scale, like 99% of spherical graphite. This is an asymmetric structural advantage. It's not a market anomaly.
Second, the control over these small, indispensable materials. The heavy rare earths like terbium and dysprosium, the processing for gallium and germanium, it provides this immediate, targeted leverage. It allows Beijing to exert pressure on global defense systems, from F-35s to nuclear subs, and to fundamentally shape the global energy transition by controlling the core components of EV batteries and solar panels.
And finally, the strategic fallout is all about time and cost. The policy is designed as non-kinetic deterrence. It achieves systemic degradation by disrupting the industrial tempo, creating a generational technology gap that solidifies within about 5 to 8 years. The most profound consequence isn't the immediate price volatility. It's the fact that the cost of entry to rebuild these foundational processing capabilities outside of the dominant system, measured in hundreds of billions of dollars and a generational time lag of 5 to 10 years, has now become the ultimate structural barrier. Strategic control of dirt is now the single greatest point of leverage, giving one nation the power to determine the tempo of global decarbonization, technological advancement, and potentially military preparedness for the entire next decade.